sucks. Nuh-uh, it's already perfect.
Yes, yes. Ted Racy, you're known for his for being emotionally put together or something. I don't know, man. He can be kind of a jerk, but he's a great designer. He's a great designer, you know. Anyway, so yeah, so we'll be going country to country. You want to talk about the origins of the war first?
Yeah, just for a bit. I mean, I'm sure almost everybody here will know that already, but just to make sure that people know sort of about some of the interlocking alliances and how, had the war started a few years earlier or later, it might have been different in terms of who was on what side. So,
Yeah, it'd also be very important we get into Germany to discuss the degree to which they are guilty for the war starting, if you will. That'll be a big one, of course. But and yeah, just to let them know, yes, we are definitely still doing a giveaway. We're just collecting money from 2 weeks ago to determine who gets a book or two this time, okay? So just making that one clear. But yeah, we can talk about the overall path to war. It's worth keeping in mind that when this war happened, when this war starts, there had not been a European-wide conflict in 100 years since the Napoleonic Wars. Now, it doesn't mean, of course, you didn't have wars, Franco-Prussian, Austro-Prussian, wars for Italian unification, Crimean War, and all those conflicts, of course, are very important. And the Austro-Prussian War in particular could have been dragged out. That one actually might have mutated into something more on the scale of World War I. But that just hadn't happened until 1914. And so getting into why, there's so many reasons given. Some people will get into things like the fact that there hadn't been a war in so long that people kind of forgotten about how horrible war was. And there's this idea that going to war would be some great, exciting adventure, if you will. You still had romantic notions of war. There's also a theory I like a lot that all these European countries had spent the 1800s gobbling up Africa and Asia. And once they ran out of territories to conquer, they turned on each other. I think that's got some relevance in there, particularly when you consider Germany and their position as an empire. Anyway, you got any thoughts, Thersites?
I mean, I have to say that there is that thing that all the high school teachers like to show or share. What's it called? It explains World War I in the context of a bar fight.
Yes.
As silly as it is, I think it's basically accurate. Because it was about interlocking alliances and secret agreements and a system of diplomacy where the goal was not to produce peace or any specific outcome, but rather to be more clever than your opponent. So World War I is where being too clever by half gets you. It gets you stuck in the trenches with rats and feces and trench foot, periodically being blown to pieces by artillery and machine guns.
I think another reason too. I think another thing that like leads to this war is, would you say like a kind of a diplomatic miscalculations, right? That's what I say. That's what I say. There is no one power in Europe that is strong enough to mitigate the rest, right? To really, in other words, like Britain was the most powerful country in the 1800s, but by the time you get to World War I, their power they're on the decline. Now they're not on a steep, rapid decline at this point, but they are no longer the economic giant they once were. They are being overtaken by America and Germany. And I do believe that World War I is also happening in part because there is a growing power vacuum, if you will, in addition to your great power competition, and the fact there's a lot of parity between these countries. I mean, with very few exceptions on this, of the nations we're going to go over, if one of these nations had fought the other one one-on-one, I mean, who knows what would have happened, with the possible exception of Germany, because Germany by that time has large population, economic powerhouse, and the overall best army amongst all the powers. Although it should be kept in mind, all of the armies in this war go into this conflict with major flaws in their doctrine, Germany included. Germany just has other advantages, such as their staff work, if you will. So...
Also, one weird thing, I guess if we ever come back and do generals of World War I, we'll see it even more, but I've noticed that a lot of the senior commanders, especially the famous people, Petain, Cadorna, Hamilton, a lot of the senior dudes in this war from pretty much every country were guys who'd retired a few years before 1914, were then recalled, and then given some of the most important assignments. And I can't think of any other war where that's the case, where almost everybody who becomes famous, or at least half or so, were guys who were retired when the war broke out.
Yeah. Yeah, well, I didn't know that. That's interesting. Yeah, Petain's an old man by this war. I mean, the guy lives to be like almost 100, right?
Yeah, I think he almost died of pneumonia or something like that during the winter at Verdun. So, I mean, he was already in his 60s and everything else, and then 20-plus years later, he's leading France for the Nazis, or at least Vichy France.
I like the story where when he got called in to go to Verdun, they had to knock on his mistress's door. That's where he was.
Yeah. Well, I mean, at least he was still a vigorous old man.
He was. No, everybody says he's a vigorous old man. He's still it's good mental faculties. And, of course, Petain is one of the finest commanders of the First World War, no doubt about that.
Yeah, not that there were that many good ones.
Not that many good ones for any of these countries, really. I mean, I guess Germany generally has better ones, but even they've got some real knuckleheads, right?
Yeah, I think a lot of it is that the pace of advancement in terms of technology had changed the way that battles were fought on the tactical level, and all of these guys were older, so they really had no appreciation of that. Not to mention, as you said, there hadn't been any major wars, so they hadn't seen the impact of industrialized armies slugging it out, and they had no idea how to break the trenches in the West. No one ever broke that code.
No, they eventually did.
Well, I mean, they figured out how to break it, but not without taking horrendous, unacceptable casualties.
Very true. Both in 1918, the Germans had it figured out, and the Allies did to the Germans. But in all cases, the losses are very heavy, naturally. That being said, it should be kept in mind that the wars that had happened before had also ended rather quickly. So literally, when you got guys at the Kaiser saying you'll be home before the leaves fall, he's actually not being that far off to people's experience. The Franco-Prussian War lasted maybe a year and a half. The Russo-Japanese War the same length of time. So this idea that it was going to be like a quick war, that actually wasn't a stupid idea. And you could actually make an argument that World War I very well could have ended in 1914, if not for the Battle of Tannenberg. Because if you look at it, the Central Powers are involved. There's 4 major fronts in 1914. There's the Schlieffen Plan and Germany's invasion through Belgium into France. You have the Austro-Hungarian attack on Serbia. You have the fighting in Galicia between the Russians and the Austro-Hungarians. And then you have the Germans versus the Russians in East Prussia. The Central Powers lose 3 of those 4 fronts pretty badly in the case of Serbia and Galicia in particular. However, they're able to win Tannenberg. And there's an argument to be made that if they, let's say the German 8th Army in East Prussia had been destroyed, mauled, or the Russians are marching through East Prussia, the Central Powers actually might have been like, okay, it's over. But not only do they win Tannenberg, they win big. And when that happens, the Germans readjust their strategy and said, okay, we'll win in the East and we'll just hold the West. And that was essentially Germany's strategy all the way till the fall of the Tsar and the Kerensky government. So anyway, that's something to bear in mind. I will say that I do not mock these guys for thinking the war would be short. Most of the wars have been short up until then. But yeah, tactically, they had a lot of problems. It should also be kept in mind that the way the technology had advanced was in such a way to favor defense more than attack. With the nature of entrenchments, machine guns, and it'd be hard to coordinate attack because the communications technology wasn't as good. The automobiles were not as robust and as numerous as they needed to be. Same thing with aircraft. And it should be noted that as the technology is getting better as the war goes on, they're learning to integrate the technology more. By 1918, the armies are starting to be very effective on attack, although casualties, of course, are still very heavy. That doesn't mean that World War I generals don't have knuckleheads. I mean, God, I think 2 of the 10 dumbest generals in all of world history are in this war. Luigi Cadorna and Conrad von Hotzendorf. All right? I mean, these men are straight-up butchers. And they have other competition as well. Douglas Haig's a moron. I don't care what the revisionists say. He's an idiot. He's a blockhead, ramming his forehead on a trench, okay? He likes to do massive, 3-week barrages that just tell the Germans exactly where he's going, So I do want to make it clear, there are quite a bit of idiots here, but don't think every general World War I's a moron, and these guys are definitely learning as it goes on. And it should be kept in mind, by the time 1918 rolls around, Hotzendorf and Cadorna aren't calling the shots anymore, So there's that.
Their home countries decided they couldn't afford the butcher's bill. I mean...
Yeah, that's certainly. Do you want to read off some quick super chats, and then we'll start getting to the countries?
Sure, we can go back and do that real fast. Diogenes sent one, $5. Hey, y'all, still doing the giveaway. Also, read up on any philosophy lately. We are doing the giveaway, and I believe you had a previous submission, so I think this puts you at $10.
Yeah. I haven't been reading any philosophy. I'm now doing Civil War book reviews for Emerging Civil War, so I've got a book on Vicksburg. I'm reading a book on Wilson's raid through Alabama. I'm reading a book on the Texas Revolution, Battle of Goliad, to be precise. And some George Orwell essays, and some historical essays by George Washington Cable about Louisiana history. What about you?
I have not read much philosophy lately, although a couple of the books I've been reading as I've been trying to get through my current chapter have dealt with a few of the philosophers, mostly in an indirect way. It will probably be several more months before I have the freedom to read anything that's more purely philosophical. I actually have a deadline this Friday to finish another chapter, so this week will not be a very good one in terms of reading things, although I will be writing things, so...
That's a good part. We have Elliot Dowd, $10. Thank you very much. To what degree do you think observation of the American Civil War affected strategy or doctrine in World War I? Europe did not ignore the American Civil War. Von Moltke definitely didn't. The great German commander, the one who was victorious in the Austro- and Franco-Prussian Wars. In fact, if I'm not mistaken, von Moltke actually met McClellan and discussed amphibious operations with him because of the Peninsula Campaign. And apparently Moltke was impressed with American amphibious operations. That said, there really wouldn't have been much for them to learn. The American Civil War was not some innovative experience. The most you could say would be the railroads, but armies were already moving towards integrating railroads in the movement to begin with. I would probably say the only thing that they could have learned would have been about entrenchments. But there's no evidence they did that anyway. So I don't know. This idea that if only these World War I generals had stayed in the American Civil War, there's really no evidence for it at all that I've seen. So I don't think it had much of any effect, really. And I don't really see the Civil War as being a good analog or even a prelude to the First World War outside of Petersburg. Because Petersburg is a situation that has some things in common with World War I, but even then, not exactly, really. If anything, Petersburg probably has a bit more in common with extended defensive lines in the War of the Spanish Succession than it does with the American Civil War. One thing should be said, though, the American Civil War, a lot of people when that war started thought the South would win just because of the sheer size of the territory. And the North was able to do that in no small part because of the use of railroads. So I will say that there were observers who paid attention to some of the stuff in the war, but it wasn't considered that important. And by the time World War I starting, it's like 50 years in the past. So anyway, a few thoughts on that one. And did we just get another one in? Yes, we did.
Another one from Diogenes. I mean, I feel like probably the Civil War was something they studied, but if I had to hazard a guess, the thing that would have influenced them more would be the Franco-Prussian War.
Yes, definitely. Also, the Russo-Japanese War. There were a lot. They were trying to draw a lot of lessons from that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that was also a pretty big shock to everyone's system, and apparently that, more than any other single event, really screwed over Russia's standing in the international community.
Oh yes,
Russia's prestige went straight down the toilet.
And domestically as well. But we'll get into that one. Diogenes, $10. Nice. Glad Sean's learning the story of my people. I think that he means the Texans.
Oh.
Also, what countries would y'all say have the best military track record from, say, Napoleon to World War II? That's a tough one. What do you think?
The best track record for that period as a whole? Well, I would say Germany to an extent, even though they didn't win the ones that counted the most, but their military did well. But then again, they weren't really around for the first third of that period. And when they were just being used as cannon fodder by Napoleon. Russia was on the winning side of most of its wars, even if they took a pounding and their quality wasn't always the best. Britain, actually, I guess it has to be Britain, right?
I couldn't go with Russia because of the Crimea, but also they lose World War I. I mean, World War I is the war where a significant chunk of the alliance loses, the winning alliance, right?
Yeah.
But anyway, Britain's a good contender for that. They had a few colonial misadventures in there, but I mean, they won both world wars. You had the Falklands War, of course, as well. I'd say Britain and Germany are pretty good contenders. America, of course, all these countries also have notable defeats as well, and even disasters. Like in the case of Japan, Germany has 2 disasters. I mean, they punch above their weight, of course, but they do lose horribly both times, right?
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't hand it to the U.S. in this case just because, I guess, by the criteria we've established in the past, not seriously challenged in the same way that some of these other countries were.
Yeah, I agree with you on that. I guess I'd go with Britain as well, like what you said, yeah.
I mean, Britain was consistently successful, had consistent quality, even if they were never quite the best of the best. They had both land and sea, and eventually air power to the point where they were at least competitive with the best, or in the top 2 or 3 at any given time. So I think they're probably the most consistent.
What about small countries?
In terms of small countries, actually Greece did pretty well during this period. I mean, they won their War of Independence against the Ottomans, which is kind of crazy, because Greece at that time was almost completely depopulated and had basically no leadership. I mean, fucking Lord Byron was there as the paymaster for Britain, a poet. I mean, to be fair, the Ottomans were in complete disarray in the early 19th century. The Janissary Corps was just this big rent-seeking coalition on the state that was contributing basically nothing militarily, and eventually, I think during the Wars of Greek independence, the Ottoman Sultan actually stamped them out. So there was a lot of internal dissension among the Ottomans and a lot of factors, but still, the Greeks won independence. Then they won the first war, the First Balkan War. They won a lot of territory under Crown Prince Constantine. And, yeah, they carved out most of their holdings that they currently have during this time period, and they pretty much, at least on the grand strategic scale, were always victorious. Pretty limited sample size because they didn't fight that many wars in total.
Although they did get overrun in World War II, and it was pretty brutal there.
Yeah,
and...
I mean, I guess World War II almost have to exclude for the small countries because by that point, technology and your industrial base was so important for success. Whereas even in World War I, it was already important, but it was not on the same level of importance.
Yeah, another one I'd also add to that with Greece is that they did very badly post-World War I when they tried to extend their power into Turkey itself. They got mauled bad in that one. Another one to consider, of course, is Vietnam.
Yeah, I mean, although the casualty rates that they suffered are horrific.
Very true, very true.
Somebody was talking about France in the comments. France, I would say, maybe their record is a little bit underrated. That being said, they did have quite a few defeats, but they always fought fiercely.
Yeah, the French would be... I think the French and the Russians kind of break even, really. That being said, the Italians, no, that's bad.
Yeah, it's not a good record.
It's not a good record, guys.
Because there's both the Adventures of Cadorna. You also have the glorious campaigns in Ethiopia, which that by itself, either one of those things by themselves would almost be disqualifying. World War II as a whole was not pretty for them, especially the North African campaign. There's just too many defeats. It's not to say they didn't have some individual successes or great units here and there or whatever, but overall, that was not a good national performance.
No, I think off the top of my head, the only period where they did very well was 1918 when they got rid of Cadorna and they brought in Diaz, who was a very good general. That's what the Italian army at its peak really is 1918.
Somebody asked about Portugal. I actually don't know that much about Portugal's involvement. From what I understand, they just kind of fed troops into the British trenches, right?
Yeah, they got targeted pretty severely during one of the 1918 offensives because the Germans realized the Portuguese corps was suffering from like high sickness rates and low morale. That said, I can't remember his name right now, but there was a Portuguese machine gunner, if you will, who essentially like held back a German division on his own or something insane. I mean, maybe not division, but he held back a lot of men on his own and won like Portugal's highest medal. So there is that. I can't remember his name off the top of my head though. But yeah, I've seen him on lists of like where there'd be like most badass soldiers of the 20th century. I've seen him on those lists along with that Finnish sniper who was the one called White Death. And
from Stalingrad.
No. You're thinking of the one from Enemy of the Gates. No, this is a Finnish sniper. You know, in the Winter War and the Continuation War, I think killed hundreds of Russians or something. There's also Mad Jack Churchill, who's the British guy winning the Battle of the Claymore. And then you've got Portuguese machine gunner.
Yeah.
I usually see those three on the list.
So, I guess the question now becomes, which country do we want to start off with?
Well, do you want to start with Allied or Central?
Um,
It might be best to start with Central powers now that I'm thinking about it, just because, you know, while of course some of these other countries play their own roles in making the war happen, the consensus seems to be that it's kind of Germany and Austria's fault, or Austria-Hungary to be precise.
yeah. All right. Well, which one would you like to begin with?
I guess we start with the big boy, Germany.
All right, Germany then. The realm of Kaiser Wilhelm II, who was basically identical with the Russian Tsar and the English king to the point that they could exchange uniforms and no one could tell the difference.
It's like they're all inbred or something.
Yeah, I mean, it actually is amazing. There's that famous picture where they have exchanged uniforms. Unless you read the caption, you'll have no idea which one I'm supposed to be which. Because they're literally all three triplets.
Yeah, I got different hats on and stuff. I can tell the difference, though, with the way the mustaches are for the Tsar and the Kaiser, you know?
I guess I didn't look that close, but literally, if they'd just been willing to make some minor changes to their facial hair, the Tsar and the Kaiser could have gone up to each other and said, hey, kind of tired of this whole Russia thing. You want to switch places? All right, let's go in this room together. When we walk out, we'll each go replace the other person. And no one would have ever been the wiser.
So in the case of Germany, do you have any thoughts you want to start off with?
I think up to World War I, clearly Germany had the most military success overall in recent history. So since the 1860s, they were basically unbeaten. They had built up a navy for the first time in their history. It was still pretty untested and was not yet as established as, say, the British fleet, but it did have quality.
I do want to add something about the high. I want to say something about the High Seas Fleet real quick, because this is something that I really think is not they're not getting enough credit for. Germany, in less than 20 years, built the second largest navy in the world, whose warship designs were generally as good and in many cases better than the British, and was also able to have like excellent sailors and very good admirals as well. And this isn't a country with some naval tradition to draw from. It's sort of insane, really. I don't know of any other country in the world that built a first-class fleet so quickly. And, you know, while the Battle of Jutland, for instance, was definitely a strategic victory for the Allies, tactically, I would say the Germans won. They inflicted double the number of losses, and their fleet maneuvers were, especially when they were trying to evade the British, were pretty damn flawless. So, I don't know. Do you know of anything quite like that? I mean, has any country in the world just built a navy out of nowhere almost?
The Romans, during the First Punic War.
Okay, so we got so not since the Romans, the First Punic War, had a nation built a fleet, a first-class fleet, this quickly.
Although, actually, the Athenians, after they found the silver mines at Laurium, they already had a navy, but it wasn't all that big, and they at least doubled it in the next 3 years prior to the Battle of Salamis.
Okay. The only example I know of in the last 200 years is the Soviet Union in the 60s and 70s and into the 80s. But the only issue with that is the Soviet Union did already have a decent-sized fleet and whatnot. The Germans really are creating something from almost nowhere. You know, so yeah, the Soviets. I mean, it's the best example I can think of. But even then, it's what the Germans able to accomplish with the High Seas Fleet is insane. Now, at the same time, of course, building this first-class navy makes them a more direct rival with Britain, which increases the tensions with Britain already. And so one could argue that by building up this great fleet, of course, they increased the tension at the time. They made sure Britain would be their enemy, and the fleet was never strong enough to be able to fully take on the British Navy, the Royal Navy. And I'm just talking about from a purely like technical organizational achievement. It's one of the greatest in military history, I think.
Yep, I think it's up there
Seriously.
probably.
You go from being navally insignificant to being, I'm the second most powerful fleet in the world, and except for the Royal Navy, I can pretty much sink any of you bastards.
And something that really enabled that is that Germany had, aside from the United States, the greatest industrial capacity in the world.
Yeah.
They were really heavily industrialized, so they could produce all of these modern weapons, including warships, at a much greater rate than almost any of their rivals. So in a one-on-one situation, Germany was heavily advantaged over any one opponent. They also had a pretty large population. I don't know the exact numbers, but I think they might have actually had the largest population outside of Russia.
Yes, they did. They had the largest outside of Russia. Of course, their industrial base, which also makes them a rival of Britain. Berlin at this time is starting to become a banking rival to London. That's going to be cut short by the war, of course. I mean, America, of course, had the potential to build more ships, but once again, U.S. Congress isn't going to give them much money because, you know, the Americans are wary of having an empire. And, you know, up until the 1950s, America pretty much tries to avoid having a massive standing army. If anything, back the U.S. had such a large fleet, even that was a bit against American tradition, if you will.
That's because we'd had Roosevelt in office, and TR was a bit of an imperialist.
Yeah, I mean, well, to be fair, I mean, the U.S. Navy in general, if we're talking about all the military branches of America, the most impressive overall is the U.S. Navy. All right, they have probably the best overall record. And, yeah, Theodore Roosevelt had really put a lot into the Great White Fleet. And there had been the Navy. The Navy gained a lot of the spoils of popularity from the Spanish-American War. with Dewey and the battle in Cuba. I can't remember the name of the Battle of Santiago. Which, I mean, the Spanish didn't have much of a chance, but that didn't matter. I mean, hell, they made war games out of it. Yeah, that's right. One of the first war games ever made was for the Battle of Santiago. But anyway, so what I'm saying is that the United States was definitely a naval power and an emerging one. They could have been stronger than Germany. You know, but Germany is, of course, the generals have much more political influence, right?
Yeah.
Anyway, yeah. So the high seas fleet, very very powerful. The German army does have some doctrine troubles with their army, especially in attack. However, they have very good artillery, and of course, their staff work is second to none.
Yeah, I guess they were also among the first, at least, to really have a formal war college system and all of that. So they systematically studied war in a way that most of their rivals did not. I mean,
Yeah,
granted,
although
Luigi Cadorna's genius was native to him, so he didn't have to, but most people have to read about these things and study them to become effective.
Yeah, the other one too. Yeah, oh God, man. If you ever want to read something really sad, read about officer training in the Italian army before World War II. I mean, you'll be like, yeah, no wonder you guys lost, right? But yeah, I know the Germans have their staff college work. They have to. They do emphasize tactics and operations, though. But that's because Germany is always trying to win as quickly as it can because it's surrounded and doesn't have good defensive terrain. You know.
Right.
Yeah. So the German idea is you would have to. I mean, the Germans did have a lot of debates between who you go after, Russia or France, right?
Yeah.
And the general idea was you would knock out France as fast as you could because you just could because of the way the distances were. And then once you did that, you concentrate on Russia. And there's already thoughts in Germany of the idea of creating an empire in the east, if you will. And Germany's also emboldened by how poorly Russia had done in the Russo-Japanese War.
So they weren't worried about the Russians taking them from behind while they were embroiled in France.
Yeah, the other thing too is the degree to which Germany is responsible for the war is an interesting debate. On the one hand, Austria is making its demands on Serbia. I've read that in 1912, during the Balkan crisis, Germany had thought of intervening, and apparently the Kaiser's generals told him, no, wait for an excuse in 1914, then we can get involved. And partially this is because in Germany, their thought is, we're surrounded by an alliance between France and Russia. And the Russians are in the middle of modernizing their army. Russia, they thought, would be ready by 1917 at the latest. So the time to strike is now. The time to start a war is now. And this is somewhat similar to Hitler's thinking in 1941, because Hitler also knew that after the Winter War, Stalin is modernizing his army. And that Stalin's army was probably going to be ready by 1943. And who knows, at that point, maybe Stalin invades Germany, right? I mean, it's possible. But Stalin is definitely modernizing his army and getting it ready. And so in Germany, the other thought is we must fight with Russia before they're ready. What was very important from the stuff I've read, too, was for Germany to declare war on Russia before doing anything with France. And partially had to do with socialist parties in Germany. Because they believed the only way to get the socialist parties in the Reichstag to agree with the war was to fight the Russians, because if you're a left-winger at this time, Russia is the evil, conservative, reactionary boogeyman among all the countries.
Right.
And so declaring war on Russia and saying that Russia started it, if you will, is a way to get the socialists on board. And this, by the way, created a real crisis amongst the left and socialists and communists at the time, because what they were seeing with the First World War, in particular in Germany, was they were seeing these socialist left-wing parties subordinate themselves to nationalism and the need to win a war. Now, of course, those parties will later on play a part in the 1918 revolution, but at least for the first few years of the war, they're on board. And that was very demoralizing for a lot of people on the left, you know?
Yeah, I think from what Wells was saying, but also some other things I've read, the labor movement was very much focused on international solidarity, so a lot of the leaders were very disheartened that their workers rallied to the colors as soon as war was declared.
Yeah, exactly.
Although I guess actually, if anything, the Wobblies in the U.S. might have been the biggest holdouts, the IWW, because they opposed the war and the public sort of turned on them for it.
Yeah, they were always the most extreme of the labor movement. Am I correct on that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I wish the IWW would make a comeback, but that's I guess a bit out of the scope of what we're talking about.
A man can dream. Who's that guy who was into East Tennessee history?
East Tennessee? I think you're thinking of
he was in the program with us.
A student, you mean?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. He liked the Wobblies. He was into them.
I don't remember.
No. So no, that's Germany's position. They need to win knockout blows. In many ways, it's interesting. We think about Germany going after France so hardcore in the Western Front, but in many ways, Germany's strategic plan is we're going to beat the French, but mostly we're here to dismember the Russians. And that becomes especially big after 1914 because Schlieffen plan fails, but hey, we won at Tannenberg. So Germany's strategy for most of the rest of the war is going to be concentrate on knocking those Russians out, hold the line in France and Belgium. You know, the only big departure from that, you know, until the fall of Russia is Verdun. That's the only big departure. It's why, I mean, the idea of the Germans launching a major offensive in the West, I think that's the only one really from 1914 to 1918. They had major offensive. I'm not talking about when they did counterattacks to try to reclaim land like in the Somme. But I just mean like as a strategic offensive. But anyway.
Yeah, because now you mention it, most of the battles I can name on the West were Allied counterattacks.
Yeah, it's mostly Allied offensives. Nivelle offensive, Somme, variety of offensives in 1915, where the French army really gets chewed up. Uh, but yeah, no. So that is Germany's situation. One thing I think is very fascinating about Germany, though, is when you really get into the details of it, the Kaiser is actually a restraining influence. He starts to question if they should even be going to war. The generals, of course, overrule him. There's a whole thing about the you know the thing with the timetables. Where the Kaiser said maybe we shouldn't do this, and they're like, that if we stop that, we'll mess up our train timetables because they were that precise.
I haven't heard about that.
Yeah, but here's some of the big ones. The Schlieffen Plan did call for marching through the Netherlands because there's a tiny slit of land in the Netherlands that gets in the way, and the Kaiser explicitly said to that, no, you do not attack the Netherlands, only Belgium. Now this had the effect of compressing the German advance through Belgium through a narrow corridor, but ultimately that was to Germany's benefit. The Netherlands was one of their main trading partners because they're adjacent to them, and that's where the Kaiser gets to hide out for the rest of his life. You know?
Yeah.
And so think about it. If the Kaiser said, yeah, you generals are right. Let's go invade the Netherlands over a tiny slit of land just so we can make this offensive more efficient. He could have hidden away somewhere. The Dutch would not have been there as economic trading partners, which was more to Germany's benefit, you know?
Right.
So if you're really looking at Germany in the course of the First World War, the Kaiser is the restraining influence.
From what I understand, didn't his influence wane from the start of the war to the end and sort of steadily diminish?
Yeah, essentially by 1916, Germany is a military dictatorship in all but name. Hindenburg and Leutendorf and who was on Hoffman and the rest, they were really the ones in charge at that time. The Kaiser could be involved in some strategic discussions. Like, they didn't keep him completely out the dark, but ultimately they were the ones calling the shots. God, if I'm not mistaken, I think the Kaiser even said maybe we shouldn't do the unrestricted submarine campaign against Britain.
Huh.
I think. I gotta look that up. But yeah, like I want to say that again. It's hilarious. We think of the Kaiser as this crazy, unhinged guy. I think Kaiser Wilhelm II is very fascinating, much more nuanced man than he's given credit for. And once again, he's actually kind of the restraining influence in Germany.
Yeah. I was looking at the map I have pulled up here, and I'm just noticing how none of the dots are on the capitals of the countries, because at first I thought that's what they were going for, but I suppose that can't be it unless they don't know geography at all. Anyway, that was a bit of an aside. But yeah, no, the Kaiser is an interesting guy. I think it has become something of a trope, especially in general histories, to say that Wilhelm II was unwise, and that's basically why Germany got into the war. And I guess he was a big promoter of imperialism, and especially promoting imperialism in school, that's true. But then people point to, well, he fired Bismarck, that was his key mistake. The thing is, he fired Bismarck died, 15 more years pass, and then World War I happens. So, if he had kept Bismarck around to the end of Bismarck's life, I don't see what difference that would have made in the grand scheme of things.
Well, Bismarck was also much older, of course, and by that time Bismarck was becoming more in favor of repressive measures within Germany. And to the Kaiser's credit, he was somebody who believed that he was a ruler of all Germans. And so his idea of government was much more coalition-based. And if you think about that as well with the Reichstag and the socialists, he's not trying to browbeat them into things. He wants to bait them in to supporting the war and to give them certain perks and benefits. So I think the Kaiser also, when he got rid of Bismarck, I have to be honest, I think Bismarck was on the verge of making some major mistakes in Germany. I mean, Bismarck, brilliant politician, of course, superb diplomat and everything, but he's not flawless, and he is becoming like essentially a really old, grumpy man by that time. If the Kaiser could be blamed for anything, it's get involved in imperialism, authorizing the High Seas Fleet, and while he has a restrained influence on his generals, ultimately he is interested in getting involved in a war. So restrained influence, sure, but he's not going to stop it from happening.
Yeah, I feel like he got them to the brink of war, and then he realized what he had done, but by that point it was too late. The wheels were in motion, and all he could do was make a couple of moderating influences on the edges.
Yeah, exactly. So ultimately, a weak ruler. I wouldn't even call him tragic, per se, though, you know?
No, I don't have much sympathy for the Kaiser, but I will say that although he is not the greatest ruler, he's still better than Nicholas II, who I guess we'll get to when we get to him, but...
Yes, probably so. Also, I guess what I'm trying to fight against is the portrayal of him as an unhinged buffoon. You know, I don't think he's that at all.
Yeah, I don't get that impression either. I don't think he's particularly stupid.
He can be emotionally volatile. Like, you ever read his reactions to Hitler and the Nazis? It's like, what he writes and says goes from, like, condemnation, horror, to these guys are awesome.
So he's kind of got, like, the Franz Halder personality.
Yeah, no, he's not a cartoonish buffoon, but he is definitely a bit emotionally unstable and very reactive, I would say, as well.
Might be from all of the interlocking branches of his family tree.
So, no, that's the situation Germany finds itself in the First World War. I don't know if I'd say any one country causes the war. Germany's not stopping it from happening, and in fact, the generals see 1914 as their best chance. You know, because at the same time, the German army was doing some of its own, I don't want to say reforms necessarily, but the German army was considered to be at peak readiness in 1914. Yet another reason why Germany's going to declare war on Russia, why they're going to let the situation in the Balkans get to where it is, why they're not going to restrain the Austrians when they definitely could have. Right?
Yeah.
So, anyway, you want to move on to Austria?
Sure. So, Austria-Hungary, with the possible exception of the Ottomans, might be the most complicated one of them all, just because of what a mess their country was overall. I mean, Russia, of course, had its problems, but Austria-Hungary, by this point, after 1867, had the dual monarchy, where you basically had two separate governments under one emperor, an Austrian and a Hungarian government. And those were not the only two groups within the empire, so these are just the two most dominant groups. And apparently the sort of federal system which linked together the two parliaments of each one did not give the emperor the authority to force one side to act in the interest of the other. So, to the point that, during the war, in Austria there was something of a food shortage. Hungary had most of the empire's agriculture, and the emperor had no way to force the Hungarians to send food to Austria. So this country is a shit show, all the way around. And they also
Holy hell.
Yeah, they also contain many nationalities, and a lot of smaller nationalities. If you look at where they're out on the map, you can see that out of this empire you get Czechoslovakia, parts of Poland. It looks like they gave up some of their land to Romania eventually. I think they also still rule Bosnia and Herzegovina, so a lot of what will later become Yugoslavia, which is then subdivided into Croatia and some other countries. I mean, look, this is a mess, and the whole idea of the dual monarchy was to give more representation to keep people happy, but clearly that was not really working. When they enter the war, they're under Franz Joseph, who by this point had been in power since, I think, 1848, or I might be making that year up, I don't know, but he'd been in power for a very long time, and he was extremely old. And when Franz Ferdinand was assassinated, he was the heir apparent, and the only guy who really sort of had a handle on how complex this empire was, and had some sort of popularity in general that would have enabled him to govern effectively. When he dies, this then makes his, I think, brother the heir. It might be cousin, I don't do family trees. But eventually his cousin will take over after the old man dies in 1916. And it would have been at that point where he would have needed to make constitutional reforms to get more central authority over his government. And he passed up the opportunity and did his coronation on Hungarian soil to show the Hungarians that he would stand up for their prerogatives. Which also effectively alienated one of his prime ministers, too.
Oh, damn.
Yeah, so...
Oh.
Yeah,
you should know, 1848. He'd been around since 1848.
Okay, that's what I thought. All right.
But the thing to know about Franz Joseph II is that, in many ways, he's a very successful ruler until this moment, because he was a very capable ruler, and he was very popular in the empire. And there's an argument to be made that with his death, the empire's last unifying symbol and personality was gone, and that combined with the military defeats and especially the economic devastation. I mean, probably no country in World War I has been more economically devastated than Austria-Hungary. All of these things combined are going to just destroy the empire.
Yeah, so another thing to keep in mind is that of their industry, 3/5 of it was near the Crown Lands of Bohemia. So their industry is super concentrated, but a lot of the resources are in Hungary. Most of their food supply comes from Hungary. Also, Budapest, which is the Hungarian capital, has most of the armaments. Or not most of the armaments, excuse me, but probably the other 2/5 or close to it. And then they have a lot of the minerals nearby that are needed to make these weapons. They also have a lot of social inequality within the empire, and because each half has its own parliament, there are different policies in place. So Hungary in general is more prosperous, but it also has greater inequality. If you look south at Bosnia, they had literally just tried to free the serf peasants of Bosnia called the Kmets, or I don't know how you say it, but Kmets. And up to 1908, these guys owed 1/3 of their earnings to their landlord. So they had passed a law in 1908 where basically the crown would provide money for them to buy their own land and end serfdom there, but this program had been very slow to move forward, so a lot of people in Bosnia, even though their lives had improved just a little bit under the Austrians as compared with Ottoman rule, they were still thinking, you know what, we'd be better off if we were just on our own. So there are a lot of people in this empire who are not really going to participate very loyally or enthusiastically. So of all the countries involved, they might have the lowest overall morale. So that's a factor. Another thing to keep in mind is that I think of all the countries, most of them were expecting a quick victory, but I think Austria-Hungary needed a quick victory. Without a quick victory, all of the social problems that they had within would boil over and cause problems.
Also, of all the armies, they are going to be the one that proves to be the least capable of replacing losses amongst soldiers, but especially officers. Because Austro-Hungarian Officer Corps actually is pretty good in 1914 on the junior level. Like, when you get to, Corps and above, you got a lot of problems, right? But as those officers are getting chewed up with the battles in Galicia and then the counterattack to try to save Przemysl, which is really one of the worst military disasters you could ever read about. I mean, men marching around the Carpathian Mountains with cardboard shoes, all right?
Yeah.
I mean, they can't recover from that. You're right. They needed it because of the social problems and because of the nature of their army as well. They just don't have a good enough system to replace those kind of horrendous losses.
Yeah, and also there's a lot of instability in the government because they're not achieving results. So the Austrians are constantly sacking prime ministers, especially after 1916 when the new emperor takes over. I can't remember his name right offhand. Charles I.
Carl.
Yeah, or Karl I.
Carl.
So yeah, he takes over and now he's trying to search for solutions. The Austrians also engage in a lot of secret diplomacy to try to end the war because they understand that things are fucked and their number one priority is surviving, even if they end up taking some losses in terms of territory and prestige. So they enter into some very intense negotiations with the French in 1917 that fail. But then in early 1918, those negotiations, what were they called? The Sixtus negotiations, are then revealed by the French in the spring of 1918. And this really undermines the emperor's credibility, because it looks like he's selling out his subjects, and he kind of was, and he's also selling out his allies. Although Germany and Austria had a secret agreement that either of them could do secret negotiations as long as they informed the other, but apparently the emperor hadn't really told the Germans enough about that, so that pissed them off. Just a total disaster. And by 1918, though, the country was literally coming apart. In 1916, Romania jumped in because they thought that they had a good chance of picking up land at the expense of Austria. And before that, they were wavering because they didn't know whether they wanted to try to pick off stuff from the Russians or from the Austrians, but they decided Austria was an easier target. And that's why they entered the war in August 1916. But then when you get to, I think it's also 1916, I can't remember what part of the year, but there was an assassination of, the Austrian Prime Minister was assassinated by the son of the chairman of the Socialist Party. And this was the first act of open defiance in any of the belligerent powers against the government.
Oh, wow.
But then when you get to 1918, things are completely off the rails. In January, there are strikes in the war industry, so you got workers who are being held to starvation wages, living with limited rations under martial law. They finally have had enough, and they go on strike in a big way. The next month, in February, you have a huge naval mutiny at the city of Kotor in southern Dalmatia. And by the way, the Austrian fleet actually did well against the Italians, even though they're outnumbered. But at this point, they'd also had enough, and a lot of this is compounded by the food shortage I alluded to earlier. They get their final two prime ministers within just a few months of each other. So in August, a new prime minister, Baron von Husarek, took command. And then in October, he's replaced by a professor who then surrounded himself with his other university colleagues. And they got to make history together as they literally watched their empire dissolve. So
yeah, and also the Allies really encouraged it post World War I as well.
Yeah, especially Italy, because Italy, the reason they joined the war, get this shit, okay? So before this, if you see on this map, Italy was part of the alliance with Austria-Hungary and Germany. But they decided not to enter the war in 1914 because Austria had not asked their permission before going into Serbia. So they got them on a technicality. And the reason they did that is because Italy's primary territorial ambitions were things held by Austria. So stuff in Dalmatia and a little bit to their north, especially Asanzo, a place where Luigi Cadorna commanded about 8,000 offensives. So they decided that they needed a way to get into the Entente, and this was their excuse. They took it. And now they had a chance to make peace with Italy and give them some concessions to keep them at bay and out of the war, or possibly to win them back. And Germany is begging Austria-Hungary to do what they have to do. So Austria-Hungary begins to reluctantly offer up some of the territories that the Italians want. But while that's going on, in late 1914 and early 1915, the British and French are also in Rome. And they're saying, you know what? If you join us, we'll let you have all the things you want and more. And the Italians were thinking, that sounds great. And also, if the Austrians end up winning the war, there's no way that they'll honor their agreement. And up to this point, everything that the Italians had liberated from foreign crowns, they had liberated by arms. If you look at the campaigns of Garibaldi, for instance, these had been liberation movements. So there was sort of this romantic idea that we must claim our homeland through blood, not by negotiation. So a lot of the Italians are geared up to do this by military means. So although Austria-Hungary did come around to offering Italy what it initially wanted, the Italians then asked for more, and Austria-Hungary then had to reconsider, is that worth it or not? But before the Austro-Hungarian diplomats could either concede or deny the demand, the Italians declared war in the spring of 1915. So yeah, Austria then had to fight that front too.
Probably few countries entered a war with more shameless ambitions. I mean, Italy's just a bunch of jackals in this conflict.
Well, no, I mean, and they were literally bribed by the British and French. That's why they switched sides at the last minute. And apparently, though, one thing the Austro-Hungarian government had going for it is that they had broad, overwhelming support for the war against the Italians, because most of the people saw the Italians as traitors.
Oh, wow.
But otherwise, morale was very low, and people didn't really care about the war, and a lot of the minority nationalities were just looking to break away.
You know, this kind of explains why the Austro-Hungarians mostly did very well on the Italian front, really.
Yeah, that was the one place where they had morale, where they thought the war was a just one.
They also, I can't remember his name, but the Italians also had, I mean, the Austro-Hungarians in the Italian front also had a very good, probably their best general of the war, army-level general of the war was there, a very good defensive commander.
Was it the Croatian guy?
I believe it's Croatian, yeah.
Yeah, because they also, at this point, had started to integrate a few people who weren't Austrian or Hungarian into the upper echelons of the army. So they had one Croatian field marshal who was arguably their best general.
Yeah.
So if they had done more of that earlier, maybe they would have been able to keep their empire together. Because they dealt in one major nationality while ignoring all the others, right? So that was kind of a problem.
Also, Croatia would have been easier one for them to do that because Croatian soldiers kind of had a legendary status in the Austro-Hungarian army.
Oh.
Yeah. The famous Pandors, who were these light infantry that fought in the War of the Austrian Succession, was one of the conflicts where they really gained a lot of fame. And so Croatians already had like a kind of military mystique within the empire to begin with. So no surprise they would integrate them before the other ones. Probably also helps to have a good buffer against Serbia, which we'll get to a little later. I think that the problem with Austria-Hungary is that they made their demands on Serbia, and the Serbs accepted all the demands but one. And you really get to that point where you think to yourself, Austria-Hungary at that point could have said, okay, that's cool enough. I mean, it was pretty humiliating. right?
Right.
And we'll get into the stuff with Serbia as well. But I know Germany and Russia play a very, very big role in making World War I happen. But if somebody like, and Serbia as well, but if somebody like fucking holds a gun to my head and says, you got to blame one country, I got to blame Austria-Hungary, they could have just accepted the fact that Serbia was giving in to them 90% of their demands. You know, but nope, they won the 100, which had 100% was essentially the equivalent of Austria-Hungary wants to go to war, guys.
Oh, Mr. Deicide says that pander means cop, and it was a vernacular term.
Okay. Yeah, the Croatian light infantry were very, very effective in the Age of Horse and Musket. You know, particularly the War of the Austrian Succession and the 7 Years' War is probably their high point. But anyway, also Napoleon had a very high opinion of Croatian soldiers.
Oh, really?
Yeah. But anyway, you want to answer a few super chats, and then we'll get into the Turks, who are also complicated, or do we have more to say about Austria?
I think that pretty much covers everything I have to say about Austria. I actually found them interesting to read about. I had never really read much about their history. I tried to start at the beginning with the books I have on them, but some of the dynastic politics of the Habsburgs I just don't find that interesting. But by the time that we get to World War I, that complicated mess is amazingly interesting. So anyway, our next super chat comes to us from Diogenes again for $3. Thank you. Have y'all heard of Max Stirner, egoist philosopher?
I've heard of him, but I don't know much about him.
I've not heard of him until just now, and I also obviously have not read him. I'm also not 100% sure what egoist philosophy is.
Well, I'll write that down to look him up sometime and see what's up. C.S. Ventura for 5, thank you very much. What do you think of Kaiser Wilhelm II, specifically how he has continued to resonate as a political figure despite his shortcomings? I guess we kind of answered that one, but it is interesting that he's remained in people's like historical memory more than you'd think, right?
Right.
I mean, if you say the Kaiser, I mean, there were other Kaisers. We only think of this guy, right?
Right.
There's only one the Kaiser.
Even though technically there were more, but no one cares about the other ones.
Yeah. But no, there's this guy, and this is definitely the Kaiser. You got any other thoughts on Wilhelm II?
One thing I do find interesting is that, of course, when he came to power in 1888, he was still pretty young. And he'd probably been middle-aged by the time World War I broke out, but he's still portrayed as a sort of young buck who has not much sense. So I think it's weird that sort of this image of him in his youth became the image of him for the rest of his life. The memory of him that people have is frozen in time.
Yeah.
I guess I've always found that kind of interesting because he's always kind of portrayed in that way as if he's still that same young guy. The way people talk about him.
What's our next one? Again, C.S. Ventura again. Austria-Hungary's military contribution is underrated. If anything, the people and army was able to hold the line after so much hardship and defeat.
Fair point.
I do agree with you. I do agree with that because if you think about the Austro-Hungarian military, they're going to suffer within less than 2 years 3 military disasters. The opening battles in Galicia, the Carpathian Mountain counteroffensive, which I think really broke their backs, and then, and also the initial failed attack on Serbia, so actually 4 of them, and then the Brusilov offensive. And the fact that they are still fielding armies, holding the line against Italy, and playing a major role in the fall of Romania means the Austro-Hungarian Empire, for all of its shortcomings, definitely had a little more juice than it may look like at first. But, I mean, I guess, I don't know, the Germans, what was that line the German staff officer said about fighting with the Austrians as your ally? It's like